It is to my firm belief that no government system that has ever been created, nor one that will ever be created, has ever or will ever succeed in what they set out to accomplish. In fact, I would say that eventual failure is inevitable. In this video series, I will be breaking down and analyzing two such systems, communism and capitalism, and articulating as to why I believe that both systems have already failed at the fundamental level. Of course, I realize that these are technically economic systems. However, I chose to analyze them specifically for two reasons. In countries where these systems are relevant, they both drastically affect those governments' policies, while simultaneously reflecting the core values of said nation, to the point where the very identity of the country is fundamentally tied to its economic system. In the modern era, the distinction between a country's economic system and its government and national identity is exponentially deteriorating. As such, considering them to be almost one and the same is not too drastic of a stretch to assume. Generally speaking, when a country is more capitalistic in nature, it has a smaller government in practice and more of an outward appearance of freedom. When a nation leans more towards communism, it has always involved a larger government role, and its people have less freedoms in terms of flexibility in their lives. In extreme cases, even basic freedoms are denied. Secondly, I live in the United States, and the public discourse between the two is increasingly relevant to say the least. For this video series, I will be categorizing the failures of multiple countries under either capitalism or communism, and then break down why such shortcomings occurred, how it directly affects the freedoms and rights granted to its people, and how it ties to the actual government system that each individual country has in place. Furthermore, I will spend significant time going over the core reasons that, broadly speaking, I believe no government could ever succeed in the ideals it presents forth, an idea that is innately tied to the core foundations of what makes humans who they are, and thus can never be broken away from. This series will be broken down into three separate parts: communism, capitalism, and a video analyzing the core human foundation that makes a truly successful government an impossible ideal. I will also put forth that, of course, this is only my thought process on this whole situation. If you disagree with me, I would love to hear about it in the comments. I've already talked to multiple people who don't see eye to eye with me on this topic, and even a few who believe my grasp on communism is not even entirely accurate. Ultimately, the powers that be in this world are not going to watch this video. Even if they did, they would not listen to it. So I'm making this as a way to engage my audience and spark up a debate on the topic instead. Lastly, I'm not entirely sure what visual footage I should be using for this video, and I'm still debating if I want to use a camera on this channel. So for now, enjoy some gameplay footage of me playing what I consider to be the greatest game of all time, Nier Automata. There won't be any spoilers or anything for the game, and if you haven't already played it, I cannot recommend it enough. And with that introduction out of the way, please enjoy. I don't believe it would be any stretch to state that American children have been brainwashed since birth to view communism, or any system that even bears a semblance to communism, as something as inherently evil. If you are an American, I will not even need to explain this concept to you, as I'm sure you will immediately understand what I'm saying. However, before I dive into the many failures of communism as a system in practice, I will first outline the positive components and ideals that make it up as a system on paper. Theoretically, communism should be the most fair and equal form of government and economy that could exist, or at least with what we've come up with thus far. In this way, one would only disagree with such a system based solely on their own desires. An example being that said person may just love the wild scramble for the top. They may feel that competition is what fuels human innovation and passion. On that, I will neither agree nor disagree with them. However, it couldn't be said that this person believes communism is inherently evil, just that they personally don't wish to live in such a system. To my knowledge, communism is the most streamlined version of the people rule themselves. It was birthed out of the frustrations of the working class, who saw the rich prosper off the back of unethical labor. They became enraged by this and thought of a system where everyone would be equal. Every person would be a part of the working class. In its most basic form, communism changes the value of labor from what the market deems it to being measured by the actual output. In simpler terms, a wage would be directly determined by the amount of work one was doing. Marx saw the upper class doing nothing but exploiting their workers, as they don't directly produce anything, yet profit off the unpaid labor that came with the surplus. With this groundwork laid down, the question then becomes, how does one accomplish such a shift, especially when the wealthy hold all of the power in the situation? Essentially, what has almost always happened is that the working class rebels and forms a new government, of which is made to initially control every aspect of the nation, including wage control and wealth distribution, to get the people on the right track, and then, when it was deemed fit, would slowly phase out of existence. In this way, the working class would quite literally rule itself, with no proper government even in place. To many, this is the very personification of freedom. This is what Marx envisioned, and it seemed to solve the class tension that was one of the world's largest issues during the start of the Industrial Revolution. However, the core issue with communism in practice is that stipulation. When is it deemed fit? The people in power, through the revolution, gained more control over the people than possibly any nation before them. The system was meant only to be temporary, but it was left unclear as to what consequences there would be if said people in power wanted this new government not to be temporary but permanent. There was no checks and balance system in place, and no real incentive to push the transition to a governmentless nation. They could essentially do whatever they wanted, as they held the finger to the pulse of the very economy, and, as is almost always the case, this new government did not wish to relinquish its control. This desire to be dominant and hold power over others will be the main focus of part 3 of this video series, so I will not directly tackle it here. However, rest assured, it is the predominant factor in why governments always fail. By analyzing the most notable example of a communist system actually put into practice, the Soviet Union, we can come to better understand the specific ways in which the system failed, why it failed, and why such failures will always apply to any society, large or small, that employs communism as its government and economic system. Its most notable flaw is that the path to dictatorship becomes exponentially easier. It's not hard to see why, as all of the nation's power gets funneled to a group of individuals and, as seen with the Soviet Union, one person. It seems obvious to state this, but why exactly is this always the case, especially when communism should technically provide the most freedom that any system could realistically hope to accomplish, at least in terms of equality and equity for all? Furthermore, why do the people allow for such dictatorship to take root in the first place? For me, this can generally be broken down into 2 parts. I will start with the first and most obvious when discussing how communism specifically makes dictatorship so much easier. The temporary government that is put in place essentially takes control of the entire country, and most notably, the economy. The ideals of communism were birthed during the Industrial Revolution, where wage gaps across the entire world saw dramatic increases. To eliminate this problem, it was deemed fit that the government take control away from the greedy corporate heads, who were siphoning millions of dollars to their own funds off the back of laborers. By doing this, the government gained control of all the nation's production. Of course, the economy is the very heart of any prosperous country, and quite literally is the system most directly involved with the livelihood of its people. Once a single entity gained complete control over all that, there is little anyone can do to force them to relinquish that power as originally intended. With the obvious out of the way then, we come to the second point, and the one that highlights how the public allows for this to happen. Simply put, the people were desperate. When a community is starving and working inhumane hours with even more inhumane conditions, they will essentially believe any decently charismatic leader that comes with promises of liberation. Secondly, those leaders usually unite the people under a common enemy. We've seen many cases of this take root in even non-communist countries. Notable examples that spring to mind include the incomprehensible amounts of inflation that ravaged Germany after World War I, allowing Hitler to rise to power while labeling the Jewish people as a common enemy. A second, more recent example, although not one directly comparable to the horrific crimes produced by the first, would be Donald Trump capitalizing on race tensions and party divisions, while spurred on by a drastic increase in movements revolving around immigration and police brutality, with an ever-increasing polarization of the two-party system to win the presidential election, while also fanning the fire of anti-immigrant, more particularly anti-Mexican, sentiments that were already deeply rooted in the dark underbelly of the American consciousness. Of course, these cases don't directly reflect the issues plaguing the newly industrialized nations that were converting to communism at the turn of the 19th century, but they all equally show the trust that desperate citizens, usually unjustifiably, will place in a leader in a system that vows to directly fix the issues. If the working class in Russia had been prospering, communism would probably have never taken hold in the country. Without despair, the Soviet Union would not have been born. The Communist Party appealed to the struggling working class and labeled corporate heads as the common enemy. By doing this, they were able to completely take over the nation with little resistance from the majority. With such blind trust, the powers that came to be could do virtually anything they wanted during that buffer period, until the citizens realized what was going on. And by that time, their youth were already brainwashed to believe in the new ideals, and the older generations that disagree with them were too late to do anything about it. By taking advantage of deep-seated hatred and anxieties that the majority held, the Communist Party in Russia was able to take full control of the nation's industries. And with little in the way of legitimate resistance, that gave birth to a dictatorship that virtually nobody on the inside could put an end to. Essentially, the system that was created to finally give the people their freedom was used to completely take it away. To say the system that was in place in the Soviet Union was anything but a failure in practice would be purely wishful thinking. When displayed at virtually any size, communism consistently fails, as the very foundations of establishing the new regime directly lead into the complete takeover of the livelihood and freedom of the people. By taking over the economy, the temporary government holds its finger to the very pulse of the nation. Thus, the ideals of communism, when actually put into practice, are fundamentally flawed and will never work as is. More detail into exactly why that is in terms of human nature will, once again, be further elaborated on in part 3 of this video series. With all of that being said, and all of my ranting about how communism can never work, I will now take this section to briefly outline a theoretical situation in which a communist system could successfully be implemented, and still adhere to the exact principles that Marx believed in. However, my situation here can only function under a closed environment, and is so unbelievably unappealing that I can imagine the only people that would find it favorable would also believe 1984 to be an uplifting utopian novel. The first step is simple. The world's most historic conqueror must quite literally take over every nation on the planet. For the sake of this thought experiment, they may do this within any means necessary, no matter how gruesome. There is also a stipulation here. This new ruler must be such a fundamentalist Marxist that they are essentially on par with Marx himself in terms of ideals. This is, of course, what I find to be the most unlikely factor in this scenario, but I digress. The next step would be to break up the nations of the world into countless but distinct groups of about 100 people each. I say distinct because this should not be done by random selection, as the individuals most compatible with each other should be grouped together, as to have the least amount of in-group fighting as possible. Moreover, this transition would need to take place over the course of a generation. That is because every child that is born from these groups will need to be taken away from its parents and placed in a massive communal living facility where they will be broken up into groups of their own and be raised by selected adults, brought up with only the principles of communism in their heads. I imagine this place to be akin to the garden from Darling in the Franxx. White, washed-out walls, minimal contact with adults, yet vibrant communication amongst the children. Of course, they will only be talking about one thing, the ideals of Marx. With this established, we can then assume that, generally speaking, almost all of the children being raised in these facilities will be fully indoctrinated into Marxist ideals. The small percentage that may fall through the cracks would then be weeded out. When these children reach a certain age, let's say a first group will range from 18 to 25 years old, the group will leave the facility and venture out to their assigned area. However, they will never see their families again. During this time, behind the scenes, the adults of the world will be relocated several times to harsher environments and eventually killed off. Truthfully, they were only left to live for a short time in the first place because the world needed their children. Since they cannot be indoctrinated from birth, they cannot be left to live in this new communistic world. When the new generation arrives at their homes, it will be as if they are travelers encountering a foreign planet, establishing the first civilization the world has ever seen. Furthermore, from their worldview, only 300 people will matter, their own community and 2 other nearby communities in which they exclusively trade with. Since the world's population has been dramatically reduced, resources will not be an issue for these people. They have also been placed in environments that are extremely favorable to live in terms of both weather and natural resources. This population control will persist, as no community may have over 100 citizens at once. If they happen to go over that number, the odd child out will be sent to one of the two other local communities and be brought up there, in a system similar to what is seen in the book Utopia by Thomas More. If there is no room for them there, they will simply be killed off. While these new communities begin their lives, those of old will be snuffed out completely. The conqueror that established this new world order can gaze upon his creation proudly, and will then end his life, as he is the final remaining remnant of the old world order. With him gone, however, the question must be asked as to what system will govern the people, as they surely can't just be allowed to do whatever they want. What about laws? The answer is simple. They will be the first society to truly govern themselves. Their indoctrination period, which was carried out at an unprecedented level, will assure they can perform this task with only the most idealistic Marxist thoughts in mind. Of course, I'd imagine that a few will inevitably fall through the cracks and, God forbid, even start to slack off. But not to worry, as the indoctrinators thought all of this through. Any weeds in the system will be plucked out, as this new generation was taught to kill anyone that broke the precious system they had in place. History has taught us that sacrifices have often been viewed differently as straight-up murder in the eyes of those societies, so I don't imagine such killings would pose much of an issue. And thus, the communities will live on, following the ideals of Marx to a T until future generations may build upon them or, perhaps, even dilute them. But nevertheless, we've done it. We've created a true communist society that may function as originally conceived. Of course, my point here should be clear. Communism can never work, not unless we quite literally take away the people's humanity while simultaneously killing off most of them. Complete order and control through brainwashing cannot be made to establish a society of humans, but instead of one of robotic sacks of flesh akin to vegetables, living without any semblance of a purpose, with no diversity of thought. If my only conceivable scenario for a working communist system is ripped straight out of a dystopian novel, it can surely be concluded I cannot actually see it being feasibly possible for humans specifically to live under such conditions. So then, let us answer the question, is communism evil? No, of course not. Despite the unfounded fears of many conditioned Americans, there is nothing inherently wrong with the system that Marx envisioned. It truly is the people ruling themselves. However, my main point in this video, and in this series as a whole, is to highlight how systems, such as communism, consistently fail in practice. As previously stated in the introduction, I am a firm believer that no governmental body will ever achieve anything but failure. For it is not the nature of the ideals we humans dream up that is wrong, it is us humans ourselves. And for those who think capitalism is the answer, oh boy, you will not like the next video in this series. If you've made it this far into the video, once again, I appreciate you. Damn it, this time I might even marry you. I sincerely hope you enjoyed my dissection of communism. Truthfully, I could have gone into more depth, especially with my outlining of a working communist system, but I wanted to keep it short and sweet. Furthermore, if you watch this video and think I'm an idiot who has no idea what Marx actually thought, great! I would love to have productive discourse in the comments. All of this is in purely my mindset on the matter, and I am always open to people challenging those ideas. As you can tell, this video drastically differs from my previous video in terms of subject matter. My concept for the channel is to essentially split the content in half. One side will be purely political and more philosophical breakdowns like this video, while the other side will be more focused on anime and other media, but still taking a more critical and analytical approach to it. Once I finish this video series, I plan to do a video on either Serial Experiments Lane in the concept of connectedness, or Near Automata with the angle of happiness and existentialism. It could be either of these, or something else entirely, we'll see. As for the next episode of this series, we will be taking a deep dive into many components that make up capitalism, eventually breaking it down to reveal how it can never truly function correctly in a similar vein to this video format. However, I do imagine it will be much longer and a more interesting video. I don't yet have an estimation as to when that will be released, but it should be in the near future, especially if this video performs well. If you want to be kept up to date with it, please be sure to subscribe and of course hit that lovely bell icon. Thanks for watching.